Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to say to you, welcome to Channel 4.
Channel 4 is 40 years old. It's a little over 7.5 months older than I am, which is increasingly alarming with each milestone anniversary. But the idea of it is older than either of my parents. The idea for a second commercial channel is just about as old as the first commercial channel. Almost from the nanosecond in 1955 that ITV began broadcasting, there were seemingly endless negotiations on the subject between the various ITV companies, their successive regulatory bodies, the GPO, Her Majesty's government itself, and anybody else who might have had a potential interest in the second commercial broadcaster. There were obstacles, of course. The BBC hadn't wanted the first one, let alone a second. The Pilkington Committee Review into British Broadcasting in 1962 agreed with them, and recommended instead a second channel for the corporation, rather than one for the commercial broadcaster. So that's what we got. The ITA didn't drop the idea though, and continued to wheedle at the necessary ears so long and so loudly that television sets began to be manufactured with extra buttons marked ITV2, under the assumption that it was bound to happen sooner or later. The necessary frequencies were even worked out, allocated and arranged for every transmitter in the nation decades before they'd actually be used, sitting there poised and waiting for someone to get off the pot. After over 2 decades of wrangling, the go-ahead was finally given in 1977 for a fourth television station to happen. Over the next few years it took shape as a commercial broadcaster run as an effective subsidiary of ITV, with a public service remit and a cherry on top. The station was going to be run by the IBA. Its ad space would be sold by the ITV networks. It was going to buy in all of its own programming from independent producers rather than making its own, which was an insanely futuristic notion at the time. And it wasn't going to be called ITV2, but numbered in its own right. After a 3-decade labour, Channel 4 had finally been born. That's except for viewers in Wales who had their own Channel 4, but that's another story. The first impression most viewers in Britain got of their new station was this: a clean, crisp, modernist logo picked out in vivid primary and secondary colours on high contrast black with equally crisp lettering underneath. It was unlike anything seen before. The designer was the late Martin Lambie-Nairn, then an up-and-comer best known for dynamic title sequences, shortly a star. It was inspired to create the iconic blocks by the fact that Channel 4 was buying in most of its programming rather than making it itself, and also its slightly vague minority remit, all of which gave the channel something of a patchwork feel. Multiple colours coming together in a vivid gestalt. Shape it into the numeral 4 and coat it in just a hint of Mondrian, and you get something like this, only less pretentious. Channel 4 were making waves before they'd even started broadcasting, just with their logo. The nation hadn't even seen it in motion yet. For that they'd have to wait until the 2nd of November 1982.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to say to you, welcome to Channel 4.
The revolution started here. This wasn't the first computer-generated ident on British television. That was the snaky thing that BBC Two were using at the time, and very impressive it was too when it first came along in 1979. But compared to Channel 4's effort, it might as well have been created on a digital watch. Nothing like this had ever been seen before 1982. Nothing. Fully three-dimensional, yet defiantly abstract shapes, tumbling realistically through, beyond and behind the corners of the screen. Nothing like this could have happened before. To get this right, Lambie-Nairn and Company had to utilise technology that simply didn't exist in this country at the time. But they had the technology to create wireframe examples of what they wanted. even strikingly detailed 2D cell animations. But Lambie wanted this to look real, even though it couldn't possibly be. He wanted the paradox. So they went all the way out to Los Angeles and hired Bo Gehring and Associates, the leaders in the field of computer animation. Between them they came up with 6 variations on the basic theme, all of which were used interchangeably and at near random until 1996. The very first one, seen running over Paul Coyer's welcome message, was called Implosion, and opened most mornings on 4 for years. Then there was the Space Trip, which was a horrible trick to play on children like me, scared of this ident. The slightly unusual Interlock, with the blocks acting more like lasers. Round and Back, another nasty trick, which was basically a pirouette. The most famous was probably the mind-blowingly epic Space Squad, which generally included the drum beat at the end of the theme on general principles. Finally, there was Explosion, mostly, though not exclusively, used at close down. Not always, though. Sometimes it ran before normal programming just to confuse you.
First on 4, time to shake it on down? Yeah.
It's worth remembering that in 1982, just having varying editions of the same ident was astonishing enough. Most channels only had one ident that they ran every time, or at most one ident and one shortened version. Channel 4 had 6, and they were all incomprehensibly futuristic. Pretty soon everybody's logo was computer generated, or had objects flying through space, or both. And many of the ones that didn't follow suit still wore Channel 4's influence on their sleeve by being so pointedly unlike them. And then there was the music. The goddamn music. Like I said, Channel 4 terrified me. But it had nothing to do with Martin Lambie. It was all because of David Bloody Dundas. My parents didn't understand. They thought I was scared of the blocks. It wasn't the blocks, although they did have a tendency to loom unexpectedly from a blank screen. But no, it was the music. I was convinced that Channel 4 was angry at me personally, and I had no idea why. It was all down to the evil genius of the man behind this bit of pop something or other. Yes, David Jeans on Dundas during his brief career as a pop star. Go ahead and laugh at his 70s hair and his 70s teeth. He's a multi-millionaire based on 4 notes. He doesn't know you a goddamn thing. Actually, he didn't just hit 4 keys on his piano and call it a day. He composed an entire 3-minute plus piece entitled 4Score. It was almost like a mini symphony, consisting of several little passages in various musical hues, all leading up to a different version of the basic 4-note riff. It was even released as a single, credited to the Airwave Orchestra, although it didn't chart. The B-side to the 4Score single was 4Score 2, a not entirely dissimilar piece, played entirely on a synthesizer. It sounded a bit like Giorgio Moroder falling asleep in front of Countdown. Unexpectedly, however, circumstances would contrive to give 4Score 2 much more of an airing than it was really expecting at the time. Remember how Channel 4, in its first incarnation, was a wholly owned subsidiary of the IBA? Well, they didn't therefore sell or even transmit their own advertising space. That was the responsibility of the IDV regions. So if you lived in Leeds, for example, Yorkshire Television would not only have sold those spaces for commercials, they would have played them out from Kirkstall Road on behalf of Channel 4. As you can imagine, this wasn't the most practical deal in the world. The franchisees had to pay for 2 channels worth of advertising. All very well for the big cheeses like Yorkshire or Thames, but smaller regions like TSW and Border were stretched past breaking point, leading to this sort of thing becoming a commonplace sight on Channel 4 in those parts of the country throughout the channel's first decade. Worse still, an industrial dispute with the Actors Union Equity made these apology slides standard nationwide throughout the first few months. For many people, Channel 4 was the commercial broadcaster without commercials. Still, nothing ever got started smoothly and without teething problems. Channel 4 managed to ride out the early days of splenetic outrage, few to no adverts, and wags from Private Eye to their once and future sworn enemies, the Daily Mail, calling them things like Channel Bore, and Channel Snore, and Channel 4 Viewers. Partly they did this simply through pure visual boldness. The papers could accuse them of being boring, and as far as the programming was concerned, they could even be right. But the packaging was still the most exciting there had ever been on British television. Between them, Channel 4 and Lambie Nairn created the first truly modern channel identity in British television. I don't want to sound like a marketing prick, but that's what they did. It helped the channel survive the inevitable wobbly first few years. So striking it was, in fact, that when the Nicaraguan Canal Cuatro found themselves almost existentially strapped for cash in the early 90s, they simply ripped the logo off wholesale, apparently on the understanding that no one would notice or care. And apparently no one did. This isn't even the only time it happened, or even the only time in South America. This is some tiny Brazilian station broadcasting to the Amazon region. Channel 4 also initiated the golden age of the trailer sting. Encouraged by the likes of Lambie Nairn and the increasingly cahiers du cinema baiting road advertising was taking at the time, 4 were one of the first channels to see their trailer packages as more than just functional items. A palpable delight in form for its own sake started to develop. Trailer stings, previously little more than vaguely flashy logo delivery systems, became seen as works of actual worth, albeit ephemeral, in their own right. Thus was invented the seasonal trailer package. This was probably the earliest, heralding summer 1983. Check the vocoder. For New Year 1984, the trailer practically storyboarded itself. "1984, guitars and lasers, woo!" That spring's effort, by contrast, was a tad bit more civilised, all liquid and husky woodwind. Practical effects-based ones tended to date slightly slower than the then ultra-modern animations, like this surprisingly ominous piece later the same year. Between the visuals and the audio, it does a good job summing up 1984, or at least how 1984 seemed to me as a toddler. By winter 1985, the channel was established and moneyed enough to get serious about this promotional lark.
8, 7, run 18.
Abstract and vaguely submarine, and with a talkback deliberately left in for reasons that they probably claimed had to do with Brechtian alienation techniques. As if to vindicate the amount of time they'd spent on it, that piece of animation won them awards. The mid-80s had arrived. Not only is it now acceptable to create lavish promotional packages and change them every 3 months, it's actually being rewarded. Before long, the seasonal trailer ethos was taken up by the BBC channels and many of the ITV regions, and the golden age was well and truly underway. For their part, Channel 4's follow-up to their award winner was relatively Route 1. Spring, flowers, pizzicato-sounding melody, all done. Whereas autumn 1985 saw them invoking the season's inherent melancholy. CGI dominated in 1986, having presumably become cheaper and more practical. Channel 4 has always liked things like this, where it's not at all clear what it's supposed to be, but it's vaguely futuristic. That was for New Year. The rest of the winter was treated to this nightmare. I'm glad I managed to avoid this as a kid. It really would have put the seal on my theory that Channel 4 hated me personally. That Spring's offering, by contrast, was so nice it could have been used by BBC One. And for the latter third of 1986, we got another confusing bit of computer animation that could only have been made in the 80s. As the 80s turned late, and the earnest Jeremy Isaacs gave way as controller to the more pragmatic Michael Grade, CGI was everywhere, even on TSW, which made it passé as far as bleeding edge Channel 4 was concerned. Time for some abstract live action.
Coming soon, exploration, adventure and discovery.
If you're wondering what any of this could possibly signify, don't. It's not trying to signify anything, it's just trying to make you look. Darley would approve, Breton would not.
A monthly magazine, Odyssey, the natural solution, starting this Wednesday on Channel 4.
Spring 1987's offering was more straightforward, wearing the art student influences on its sleeve, while also foreshadowing the look of the entire channel 20 years later. This marks a point where the trailer packages become less fascinated with the construction of the logo, having more or less explored it to death after 5 years, and more interested in nothing so much as their own selves. That autumn's trailer package, with its tasteful surrealism, really exemplified where Channel 4 was at as it approached its 5th anniversary. Self-consciously avant-garde and totally unashamed. It could just as easily be called weird. But then avant-garde weird is different from other kinds of weird. To be avant-garde is to be fashionably sophisticated, trend-setting weird. Weird in such a way that they could make a trailer package like this and claim either irony or sincerity, depending on who was looking. The Winter Collection trailers were shot by no less than Terence Donovan, one of the great fashion photographers, director of the Addicted to Love video, and the father of latter-day almost Channel 4 star Daisy. So, unsurprisingly, they looked exactly like a Vogue catalogue come to life. They also continued a practice of downplaying the Channel 4 logo in favour of doing their own thing, which continued with the paradoxically summery abstract package for Spring 88. All free jazz, vivid colours and vaguely African and or Latin influences, it was still successfully outsummered by the lovely impressionistic package created by Oscar Griot that ran from June to August.
For summer on 4.
That autumn went back to in-camera effects, with an idea that was obvious in retrospect. The world of contemporary dance was the touchstone for winter 1989. Winter always brings out the high-class sophistication in these things. It's all that gloom and cold. It forces greater effort out of the designers. Between that thing and the spring's offering, which resembled the clothes show on Ecstasy, almost the whole of the year 1989 is basically summed up. Tasteful was very much the watchword that summer. Relaxed, impressionistic, with vaguely Knopflerian acoustic guitar, and for some reason the name of the month down the side of the screen in case you weren't sure. And the autumn's one is so bloody pastoral it makes Beethoven sick. Your mileage may vary. As the 90s began, Britain slid toward recession, and Channel 4, not exactly the richest station in the country, seemed to come to the conclusion that these things might be a bit too expensive and lavish for their own good, especially if they were going to discard them every 3 months. Seasonal wallpaper began to be replaced with 1500 millisecond stings, mostly seen during Tonight on 4 menu trailers. There's simply no time to be complicated here, and the motif became to transmit the basic impression of the number 4 itself. Not necessarily the logo even, just the numeral, either in shape or in abstract with beats. Possibly by 1990 those blocks had just got so familiar that people no longer registered it as a number, or possibly they were just dicking around for the hell of it. Either way it's effective, because you're constantly thinking 4. In a way you wouldn't be, not so much if they just showed you the logo. Of course the blocks were still going strong, and proved to be surprisingly flexible. Variants on the theme, and not just for Christmas, were commonplace even before the CGI technology finally became available and affordable. It went blue to introduce Hill Street, tartan for Hogmanay, and glistening reddish gold for the summer. This was for its one foray into Olympic coverage in 1988. Why they stuck 3 smaller idents at the bottom, I don't know. They dressed them up for American football coverage, including the Super Bowl. And then there was sumo. And Italian football. Weekend mornings were for kids shows, and the logo obliged there as well. And as theme nights became highly fashionable in the 90s, they went into overdrive. There was a love weekend, a dinosaur night.
Rock Dinosaurs now on 4 pays a tribute to the music of Bob Dylan.
Some kind of science night. The 4 got a pair of platforms for glam rock night. There was a ridiculously involved sci-fi weekend for which they literally launched a spacecraft, and by literally I mean figuratively.
Sci-fi weekend is underway.
Who could forget Cannabis Night, which turned out to consist of earnest discussion about politics, medicine, and the gap between one's fingers, alternating with the odd Cheech and Chong movie. Some of those might not have happened at all, though. In the earliest of 90s, as the station's 10th anniversary approached, a suspicion began to arise inside Channel 4 that, after a decade, the blocks may have been getting a bit tired. And the 1990 Broadcasting Act mandated some sweeping changes for the channel, not least the scrapping of the IBA and spinning off of Channel 4 television into its own independent company, one that had to buy and transmit their own adverts and everything. A new era dawned whether they liked it or not, and the channel seriously started to consider a new look for it, scrapping the blocks and fourscore altogether. Perhaps the major British kingpin in visual trickery at this point was Matt Forrest, and Channel 4 knew it. He and his company Snapper Films had just reaped loads of awards for their apocalyptic title sequence to Wild, an otherwise bog-standard music magazine broadcast on 4 in 1988. So, given the whole station to remodel, what did Forrest come up with?
This is Channel 4, and now to the gridiron for the clash of the giants, American football.
This is a test, albeit complete with music and suitably generic continuity announcement. It never actually went forward, and with all due respect to Forrest, it's not that hard to see why. It doesn't really represent an advance. In fact, with its simpler numeral and only 3 blocks, it could be considered a step backwards. As a logo for the whole station, it's unavoidably less exciting and memorable than the thing it's replacing, which ensured, and has arguably continued to ensure, the survival of the original blocks. Forrest's 4 might have escaped into the wild, however. The 1990 title sequence for the Channel 4 News featured a stylised numeral that bears enough resemblance to Forrest to potentially be more than coincidence. Nothing's ever been confirmed, though, and given the extraordinarily trivial nature of the issue, nothing's likely to be. There was, however, one change as the channel celebrated its 10th anniversary. Fourscore was dropped, in favour of a synthesised tune that sounded similar but just different enough for copyright law, especially after they revised it to push the chiming beats into the background. I, of course, was delighted. Finally, 4 was safe to watch. In fact, I wondered briefly if there were other kids afraid of Fourscore and if it was us that got it changed. Actually, there were a couple of compelling reasons, and unsurprisingly, I wasn't one of them.
Now on 4, a sexist captain of industry faces a crew in revolt in tonight's film 9 to 5.
First, with the music changed from a strident fanfare to quasi-ambient jangling, it was now possible for the continuity announcers to talk over it, saving time between programmes that could be used to squeeze in another advert. Second, and perhaps more compellingly, every time Fourscore was played, David Dundas got a cut. £3.50 to be exact, every single time those 4 notes were played, and it's the theme tune to the entire channel. They were played a lot. At peak, Dundas was getting over £1,000 a week out of it. And with the abolition of the IBA in the 1990 Broadcasting Act, Channel 4 were now fully independent for the first time, selling their own advertising and fully responsible for their own funding. It was an easy and obvious saving. So out went Fourscore, and in came a pleasant but unloved and now all but forgotten tune that I don't think anybody even bothered putting a name to. Other changes were afoot. One of the things Channel 4 inherited from ITV was its schools programming. With ITV preparing for breakfast television and Channel 4 not even starting up until 4:30 in the evening in its earliest days, it was a logical thing to do.
30 years of schools education. Now we focus on the future. From the 14th of September, we move to Channel 4. The same time, the same days, the same great ITV school service, but all on 4. Stand by for ITV Schools.
Confused the hell out of Lil Me, of course, because the service was still called ITV Schools, despite being on Channel 4. None of the other kids noticed or cared. And in context, it actually made perfect sense because it was ITV schools. ITV was still completely responsible for them in all respects, bar the specific lines of airspace they broadcast them on. And of course, that futuristic CGI rotating logo remains a legend of late 80s childhoods. By the time Channel 4 gained its full independence in 1993, schools programming was embedded into their morning schedule. There was no question of ITV taking them back, not with daytime television a fact, and This Morning having run for 5 years already. It was Channel 4's wholly owned problem now. So a rebranding was in order from the start of the 1993 school year. I don't know why they went for an eerie, haunting, dark ambient aesthetic, but I'm glad they did. It was more interesting and strangely self-possessed than the chrome-plated corporate styles that preceded it. There was something cold and utilitarian about the ITV schools look. And while only a madman could describe the mid-90s Channel 4 schools as warm, it did have a personality. ITV schools felt like it was being run by a heartless machine. This weird, nightmarish, enigmatic thing felt more like it was being run by the aliens from Close Encounters. Unknowable and able to communicate solely in bleeps, but essentially benevolent. It still tried harder than ITV schools ever did. For example, for those extended longers, instead of showing a metallic logo revolving around and around endlessly until all the kids have fallen asleep, they went to the gallery. Essentially Vision On, curated by a Martian and soundtracked by the Orb and Brian Eno. Or more accurately, by Andy Carroll and Nick Moore, two-thirds of an obscure deep house act called Habit, for whom Channel 4 schools represented the start of a successful transition into modern-day Alan Hawkshaws as Amber. They also dispensed with the traditional analogue clock, switching instead to a simple digital countdown, accompanied by what sounded like an ambient suite about a doomed submarine, adding to the deathly air of the whole enterprise. A dying whale's going to call out in a minute. There you go. But the submarine's crew are long since dead. The distress signal shines away purposely and endlessly. Scorpion departs, but never arrives. It was all genuinely unsettling in a way that was actually quite thrilling, under the two circumstances under which you'd be watching these things. I was stuck in a freezing cold film room at school, waiting for some program about maths to start, once the teachers finally got the VCR working, or stuck at home with a terrible head cold gawping at a TV screen. The latter was even better if you were running a fever. Meanwhile, in the promotions department, as seasonal trailer packages died off, presentation entered the age of the grabber. That's not by bad editing, that's how it went. Grabbers are short and abrupt. Their function is essentially to stand in front of the trailers yelling, "Oi!" A slogan was developed, "Keep an eye on 4." It was just vague enough as a phrase to have several uses and interpretations. It could evoke tension and or release, or just literally the act of looking at stuff. For a while they tried to really hammer it home by having announcers repeating it parrot fashion at the end of trailers.
Keep an eye on 4.
Until that became too irritating and contrived. Still, the campaign caught on, going through several subtle and irregular refreshes over the course of about a year. It even got remixed for Christmas.
Christmas. Keep a bloomin' eye on 4.
By mid-1992, the theme had become keeping your eye on things because they were acting weird. See? Eventually, in the autumn, it evolved into one of their most enduring promotional sets. Simple and ingenious, literally tapping on the fourth wall. Early versions kept the "keep an eye on 4" slogan, at least according to my memory, but that was soon dropped. This was much bigger than that. The act of tapping on the screen was a non-verbal slogan in itself. The simplicity of it made it transcend its origins in a way that arguably no TV promotion package had ever done before. Tap tap, it's compulsive. One of the simplest actions imaginable transformed into a mnemonic for Channel 4. Its proto-internet meme status was assured when it started being parodied within an inch of its life on comedy shows. The motif stuck around for Christmas, which incidentally also saw 4Score bowing out gracefully. And continued throughout 1993. Only this time the tapping wasn't done by models or street performers or hapless ordinaries, but by the faces of the channel itself, generally in ways reflecting their on-screen personae. It was a ceaseless carnival of tapping all year round until the country was thoroughly sick of both it and Channel 4. Which was basically the stated aim, really. You know your promotion is successful when at least one person in 20 is sick of it. When the whole nation is sick of it, it's awards time. All in all, it lasted for 15 months. 1994 brought forth an end to the relentless tapping and a transition to the sort of avant-garde obliquity last seen in the Jeremy Isaacs era. The new premise was Channel 4 showing up at random amidst various cinematic tropes. Initially, the channel's name was whispered or muttered ambiently. Channel 4. But that was faintly irritating, so they made it more direct by having their usual announcers saying it aloud on those television sets. Channel 4. And this actually worked surprisingly well, because it's diegetic sound that has no right to be diegetic because it makes no sense for it to be there. Channel 4. Possibly they felt that after 15 months of Chinese water torture, it would be a good idea to include the channel's name in promotions again. Or maybe they were just trying to be clever. Either way, by the end of 1994 they'd stopped using any words at all, as well as abandoning almost any attempt at intuitive sense. By now it's the dawn of Britpop and Cool Britannia and all that bollocks. And here Channel 4 were, being pointedly European and Nouvelle Vague and vaguely reminiscent of those surrealist fashion shows you see sometimes in rubbish newspapers. Alright, so there's a bit of Far Eastern flavour here as well. The television sets do the funniest surreal video art campaign continued throughout 1994, and proved to be the last cohesive trailer package Channel 4 would bother using. For the next couple of years, they dallied with various self-consciously odd stingers. There was an explicitly off-putting motif based on symmetry, and a heartbreakingly ironic Alexandra Palace parody.
That looks splendid.
In the end, they placed their trust in the faces of the channel again.
Channel 4.
What turned out to be the last batch of grabbers placed the iconic 4 logo in a variety of confusing scenarios, alongside the stars of their programming making puns or referring to the station, or just faffing around. Quite impressively, this even included some faces from their imports, most of whom even seemed to know what was going on.
Ask not for whom the bell tolls.
It tolls for thee.
But it was becoming increasingly clear by 1996 that the spinning coloured blocks were growing tired. They'd been around for 14 years, which is pretty old in dog years and positively ancient for a station identity. They'd done just about everything conceivable with it, sometimes twice. With Michael Grade finally moving on, it was definitely time for something new. But the blocks are iconic. So much so that even Martin Lambinan himself had parodied them. Their one attempt at replacing them failed to clear the bar of their power and charisma. Refurbishing 4 was going to be a Herculean task, and Lambinan and his company were contracted to the BBC now. So this unenviable job was handed to Tomato, the extremely fashionable design collective that included the guys from Underworld and have been responsible for the titles to Trainspotting. The Channel 4 job proved so difficult that Tomato and Channel 4 eventually fell out and went their separate ways, with only the basic logo idea finalised, leaving the station's in-house design team to build upon Tomato's initial notions and create an entirely new Channel 4.
Sit down and pay attention.
October 1996. A new world has begun. Meet the Circles. I'll quote David Frierson, Channel 4's creative director at the time, and the man who operated the machine that created that blur-stroke-burn effect. The design needed to be fluid and organic. It needs to embody a sense of evolution with which the audience can share. The Circles were basically a station identity created by and for people who talk like that. Ambient in sound and vision, they usually went off without music. And by music, I mean that synthesised descending vocal sting, which was generally saved for playing before the news. Usually, all you got was the diegetic sound and the electronic hum and crackle of the Circles whooshing in.
I hope you got it on 4, Nige.
Channel 4 was finally freed from the tyranny of a black screen. Those Circles zoomed on all sorts of random bits of everyday business or bleak-mannered philosophy.
My parents told me I'd never learn anything from television. They were wrong.
Or ultimately unedifying slice-of-life vignettes. And of course probably the lion's share centred around the faces.
Let's make your heart beat faster.
Naturally, the trailers changed with the ident. Grabbers were now a thing of the past, and they all followed a strict pattern, at least at first, based around the same 4 circles. There was a big one to display the programme or its logo. There was one for the Channel 4 symbol, one to show the time the programme was on, in an analogue clock face, which was unusual, and one left over to fill with whatever other pertinent images or text they could think of. They'd stopped going to this much trouble within a year. Obviously the schools programmes had to be redesigned too, so out with the old electric ambient feel, and in with something much more standard, featuring an unfeasibly tiny Billie Piper shortly before she became a pop star. They even adapted the Circles for kids programming, although I don't think it really caught on, probably thanks to the off-putting animation style. And they brought back nighttime branding. They'd originally tried it for a couple of years in the late 80s before getting bored and giving up. Shortly after adopting the Circles, though, they dropped the nightly close down in favour of 24-hour broadcasting, with this little neon sign-looking logo showing up after midnight. It's not much, but there was more to come. Personally, I always liked the Circles. I missed the blocks, of course, but they were older than me. I knew they couldn't last forever. I always thought that the Circles were a good, strong, clear design. I appreciated the thought that went into them. They were clear and consistent. They had a strategy and a message, other than the obvious watch-out programmes. It was modern, of its time, where the previous idents were pretty clearly made 14 years earlier. It had an air of vaguely futuristic sophistication, like it had fallen out of an art gallery in the 23rd century. It's far from perfect, however, and my reaction was very much in the minority. It lacked colour and drama. The blurred out-of-focus aesthetic gave it a sense of detachment. It didn't grab you, but more than that, it didn't even noticeably try. And then there was the fact that it was just so different to what had come before. An entire nation effectively got a kind of aesthetic whiplash. And so the Circles were widely hated, and remain disdained to this day. And despite everything I just said, I still think that's a shame. Their detached sterility was almost willfully perverse in a very Channel 4 sort of way. But quite frankly, Channel 4 could have replaced the blocks with almost anything, and there would have been backlash to the moon and back. It was like David Moyes replacing Sir Alec Ferguson. It was just never going to bear the symbolic weight.
Hello. You're watching television.
So ultimately the circles just didn't catch on. A tentative attempt to relaunch them in 1998 with just the one circle died on its arse when Channel 5 came along with something extremely similar. So after a mere 3 years, the circles were abandoned and Channel 4 returned yet again to the drawing board. In this case, the board belonged to a British firm simply known as Spin. And unlike their attempts at collaborating with Snapper and Tomato, this one went off by and large without a hitch. The new look for Channel 4 debuted in 1999. That's right, they squared the circles. The new look was even flatter than before. After all, underneath the actual circles themselves, the previous idents were all about depth of focus. It was also more dynamic and urgent, which wasn't hard, especially as the circle look seemed to have been designed to be the opposite of what normal idents are. The squares were much more conventional. In fact, they turned out to be an excellent compromise, taking the communal live-action aspects of the circle idents and marrying them with a much stronger sense of channel identity. They even brought back the concept of theme music with that chill-out zone woodwind jingle. Although it was rarely heard beyond the first year, except before the news and between schools programmes. Those got an even blander new look, and were increasingly seen as the grudging duty that was keeping Channel 4 out of the daytime TV market. Before long they were rebranded as 4 Learning and moved to late nights for a couple of years, and then dropped altogether when the internet finally made them obsolete. Initially it was stripes rather than squares that were the focus of the new identity, weaving in and out of a sort of Venetian blind effect with whatever live action footage they had to hand or seemed pertinent to the programme being introduced. This sort of occasionally amusing, often faintly patronising live action material was a staple of idents nationwide for the next 20 years, and only seems to be slowly going out of fashion now. Its provenance is largely down to Channel 4 and its circles and squares. The circles proved too cold and maybe a little ahead of their time. Squares and stripes were much warmer and more flexible. It's theoretically a quick and easy way to make the channel relatable to the viewer. Show idealised versions of them in the ident. Having a punchline also helps, and of course it left plenty of scope for the inclusion of the faces, which by now was de rigueur.
In enormous quantities. It's almost impossible to
Is it me or is it a bit cold in here?
I
think the boiler's playing up.
This family kick the salt habit.
The difference is that this time the jokes and the bits of business occurred during the ident, alongside the logo, where the whooshing in of the circles tended to kill them off. Here they could sort of continue ambiently before the logo lit up as a form of visual punctuation. The design was tweaked a bit as it went on, mostly by Channel 4's in-house design team, sometimes outsourced to Static 2358. After a few months, instead of having a greyed out version of the logo sitting distractingly on the centre right waiting to be lit up all the way through the ident, it now rolled in on cue. The woodwind arpeggios were quietly dropped, and the stripes themselves became increasingly vague and impressionistic. A few notions were carried over from the circle era, for example a special Saturday morning ident for kiddie programmes. I don't care what anyone says, I like this guy a lot better than the noodly black and white kid in his pants. And thrillingly enough, nighttime branding made a comeback of sorts with the launch of 4 Later, a special, explicitly eerie strand of programming over the weekends. 4 later ran from Thursday nights to Sunday nights, or if you prefer, Friday mornings to Monday mornings, for 4 years of increasingly confusing, disturbing, and often downright inexplicable programming aimed explicitly at insomniacs, students, wide-eyed substance abusers, angry, shuddering failures, or all of the above. I watched it rather a lot, through its various repackagings. I was never terribly fond of the brain version of the logo. Not that I was squeamish, it just looked silly. 4 later sometimes used regular continuity announcers, which tended to contrast quite sharply with the surreal video art visuals, but it's best known for being linked by a piece of CGI animation called Motel. This was a sort of cross between a sitcom, the cutscenes from a PC game from 1994, and a Blade Runner-inspired nightmare. To the extent that it had a structure, it starred a pair of gay robot bartenders, a lonely shoe salesman, several deformed humans, and what appeared to be the dancing baby from Ally McBeal during his downtime.
Where's my rattle, you goddamn mothers?
And the motel's shadowy owner. At 30 seconds ago, coherence wasn't really possible or attempted, and the whole thing tended to resemble Guru-shaded fever dreams. Motel was made by Impossible TV, who went on to make thoroughly charming children's productions such as Castle Farm, containing no gay robots whatsoever. In 2001, with the dawn of widescreen as standard, Spin were recalled to update the look, taking the content that they originally came up with and developing it almost beyond the use of stripes. Instead, they became increasingly impressionistic, not to say abstract. They're still applying the same basic notion, although the live action elements weaving in and out were pretty much passé by now. Everyone else was doing it after all. Maybe they were too subtle for their own good, because by 2002 they were starting to edge into outright dullness. To me at least, they felt over-familiar, poker-faced, functional but unspectacular, and not exactly declaring Channel 4 as a station of great interest. Not that Channel 4 cared. I mean, art for art's sake in promotions went out the window around the time Keep an Eye on 4 had arrived. There was only a very brief window in which you could have it both ways. A shining moment when, say, a trailer sting could function as both good marketing and something of lasting aesthetic worth in its own right. The moment lasted for a brief time in the latter half of the 80s until it hit the wall of practical reality in 1991 or so. Frankly, we're lucky it happened at all. Besides, the station itself had evolved, just like everything. By 2002, this wasn't the channel that promoted itself with contemporary dance video art and only oblique references to its own logo anymore. Nor could it afford to be. 2002's Channel 4 was the channel of Big Brother, Richard and Judy, and endless repeats of Friends. People mourn, and not wrongly, the loss of the spiky alternative minority Channel 4 of its inception, but the hard, brutal fact is that such a channel could never have survived 40 years. In reviewing the ephemeral films they used to promote themselves over the years, we've been watching them slowly drift towards the mainstream, which is where they sit comfortably to this day, for better or worse. It's the natural progression of any non-specialty channel of decent size, at least in the commercial sector. You join the mainstream or die. Which isn't to say you have to literally transform yourself into Sky One. It is possible to strike a balance. Channel 4, for whatever reason, tipped that balance strongly toward the mainstream. There's a certain amount of false consciousness at work even here, though. People were up in arms in 2001 when they poached Richard and Judy from ITV. What was forgotten then and now is that one of the earliest programmes on Channel 4, also poached from ITV, was Mavis Nicholson's Afternoon Plus. The memory cheats. It wasn't all disabled lesbians made of pubic hair in the early days of Channel 4, and had it been, we probably wouldn't be here now. Devil's advocate can only stretch so far, of course, and it can't be denied that by the mid-aughties Channel 4 was basically indistinguishable in tone, output and quality from ITV. Or ITV a few years earlier at least, because their mainstreaming had the knock-on effect of pushing ITV even further down market, to the extent that they very nearly drowned. Stung by the criticism and noting it had been 5 years since the last full-on overhaul, Channel 4 decided at the end of 2004 to freshen up their image. After 8 years relegated to the status of a flat 2D picture, it was time for the 4 to come back into 3 dimensions. But with a twist. The 4 now loomed unexpectedly through the landscape, sometimes naturally, sometimes not. In an odd way, these almost fetishised the logo and its iconic status. These simply would not work if you weren't already familiar with it. We wouldn't know what we were looking for. We certainly wouldn't figure it out in the split second we're given with the actual logo on screen. It was interesting, original and dynamic, and importantly, it wasn't like anything anyone else was doing. Much of New Year's Day 2005 was spent in front of the television waiting for the next ident so you could try and spot the nanosecond when the logo is complete. That's one way of making the audience engage with your channel. Make an optical puzzle out of the idents, then the bastards will have to look. I'm going to pay them a bit of a backhanded compliment here, because while these are a terrific idea really well implemented, I think as idents they have a bit of a fatal flaw, specifically that it plays down the logo. By design there's no there. The logo is glimpsed for a split second as part of a tracking shot that doesn't stop to look at it. All very modern and knowing, but also rather unhelpful for station identification. It doesn't help that the novelty factor wore off inside 6 months or so. Later additions to the canon, and they released about 3 new ones every year, seem to take perverse delight in making the actual logo of the station as oblique as possible, verging in some cases on opaque. I actually think these would have worked better as trailer stings or grabbers in the kind of extended promotional trailer package Channel 4 practically invented and that no one actually bothers with anymore. Instead, the promotions of this era centred around a painfully mid-aughties redesign of the logo sculpted out of 3-dimensional negative space by a wizard. To my mind, these should have been the idents, and the actual idents should have gone in between trailers and such, the same way as the tapping on the inside of the screen did. I mean, these things are the ones that actually show the logo front and centre, which is what an ident is for. Admittedly, it still floats around and can't stand still, but at least it slows down enough that you get more than just a fleeting glimpse of what the logo looks like. But then Channel 4 is all about flipping expectations on their head. And because they're so perversely oblique, these idents did serve to reiterate Channel 4's stance as being bold, original, and different from anybody else on the block. Whether it was still true by then is a moot point. Certainly far, far worse idents than these happen at sea. This look proved to be Channel 4's second most successful, running for a full decade and change, well past the point where we were all sick of it, and approaching the one where we'd actually forgotten it could be changed at all. Then, on the 29th of September 2015, out of the blue, the channel abruptly regenerated mid-evening schedule. Starting with a clock of all things, and seeding the new idents throughout commercial breaks for the next hour. It was a great and exciting way to introduce a new look. It might have worked better if the look itself had been less confusing. The idents themselves, of which there were appropriately 4, were created by Jonathan Glazer, the man behind some great music videos, commercials and feature films. A solid choice then. And they were definitely brilliantly made and very pretty to look at. But what in the hell was going on? Where was the 4 logo? What the hell is the deal with this guy? The idea of vaguely expressing the idents themselves and only made slightly clearer in the press releases was to focus on the blocks themselves and their inspirational nature, give them a history, even an origin story. Which is nice and all and could make for an interesting promotional campaign, although a bit more coherence would have been nice. But as idents, they fail miserably at the basic task of station identification. There's no logo, you dingus. Shortened versions were even worse, leaving announcers to desperately try and introduce programming over shots of scenic lakes or a landslip in a quarry. Fortunately, the overall look provided alternatives. Trailers and such were heralded by tumbling miniatures of the 4 blocks themselves against coloured backdrops, which were also used as stopgap idents. These at least had some kind of shared identity about them, even though they were still determinedly hiding the iconic logo from view. Glazer's idents weren't exactly massively popular, and after baffling the entire nation for 2 years, Channel 4 gave it up as a bad job and replaced them, while keeping the rest of the tumbling block's identity intact. In place of jigging insectoid tribesmen and scientists scrabbling in the dirt, we got the much more relatable giant, made out of the Channel 4 blocks and doing relatively comprehensible things like having a kickabout in the street or rescuing asylum seekers. All to an acoustic alchemy arrangement of 4 At the same time, the interstitial tumbling block animations were altered so that they actually form the iconic logo once in a while. This is how Channel 4 currently looks. It's not as coherent, complete and centred as the Circles look, which really was comprehensive and tight as a drum, and it's odd that the giant never became more of a mascot to the station. These 4 idents are all he's ever had, for 5 years now. But it works. Most importantly, it's not like anything anyone else is doing. This basic look has been in place for 7 years now, a decent lifespan for a station identity. It might be ripe for a change. It might get one sooner than we'd like, thanks to everyone's friends, the flailing Conservative Party. Earlier this year, Cultural Secretary Nadine Dorries announced that the government was selling Channel 4 for a quick billion. Almost no one thinks this is a good idea, and indeed it is not. It's motivated solely by 2 things: greed and revenge for Channel 4 News' infuriating habit of questioning the government. Now it's going to change from a public service broadcaster, albeit a commercial one, to a standard remitless content provider owned by the highest bidder. Which could at this point mean Comcast, Paramount, Discovery, or any other gigantic faceless conglomerate in need of content for their proprietary streaming service. This is a situation where the best case scenario is that ITV win out. Of course, since Dorry's announcement, there have been about 8 different configurations of this Tory government under 3 Prime Ministers, and Dorry's hasn't been in any of them. Michelle Donnellan is Culture Secretary now, and the plan is hovering in limbo. If there's any sense left in the world, the plan will be quietly abandoned, and Channel 4 will relaunch with a bold new look, restoring the colour to the blocks. And Martin Lambie-Nairn will come back from the dead to design it. Channel 4 is 40 years old, and its future hangs in the balance, but it still doesn't act or look a day over 25. Thank God for that. You just sat through a Bob the Fish production. Nice! If you haven't already, you absolutely must check out bobthefish.org.uk. Literally hundreds more videos not unlike that one, adding up to days worth of entertainment and all absolutely free. But if you're not a cold-hearted skinflint, you can always support us on Patreon. For as little as anything at all, you can make programmes like the one you just watched possible in the first place, and become eligible for bonus material such as glimpses of the book I'm writing about the BBC, monthly riffings on random commercial breaks, the complete archives of the angry political satire magazine Two Sons, and even the odd very occasional bonus video essay unavailable anywhere else. If nothing else, you should prevent me from starving and or freezing to death in the foreseeable future, so that'd be nice. No pressure or anything. bobthefish.org.uk. You make it what it is.